Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. Some people may not know why we refer to that. I actually was listening to, I know I'm about to commit heresy here. I was listening to another podcast that I frequently like to listen to. By the way, I recommend it. One of the ones I really like, I like the tone of it. It's called We Got This. If you've never listened to We Got This, which is part of the Maximum Fun Network, it's two great stand-up comics, improv guys, and basically they take on any topic you can imagine and debate and discuss what it is. And so they recently had an episode on best time machine. And I couldn't help but think, I'll put a link probably to that episode here in the show notes just for our listeners, because I think you'd enjoy listening to those guys. But they were arguing about best time machine, and Alexis and I early on started talking about the what if machine as if it were a type of thing, picking up on Stuff You Should Know, which is one of our other favorite podcasts when they would do these historical things. So when we talk about being in the chair, that's the theoretical metaphysical thing we're talking about, is that somebody's in the time machine chair. Now that I've taken a minute and a half of your life that you'll never get back explaining where that's at, you'll now understand why we lead off with sitting in the chair today. But I'm not alone in whatever this is. And by the way, this could be the DeLorean. This could be the time sled from the Time Machine, if you know what I'm talking about there, the classic version. This could be the thing parent in Harry Potter. There's some type of hourglass thing you flip that does something. I don't know. Alexis would know all about that if she were here. She could tell us all about it as well. But when we talk about the magic what if machine, that's what we talk about the chair. But I'm joined today in the what if machine by Dylan Holzheimer and Chris Capola. So Dylan, I'll let you go first because Chris is the one that's properly dressed for the occasion. We can see that. But Dylan, how you doing this evening?
Doing good, Don. It's good to be back.
Good to have you back. And Chris, I'm going to suggest that maybe a good thing for you to do be to say hi to the good people.
Hi, good people.
There you go. We got our few bits. We got a little bit going for us, and so we'll go with what we have. We're continuing today along our sort of combination of things that we started over on The Room Where It Happened, and we've carried over to A Fork in Time. It's this idea of these Roman forks. And Dylan, you were a big part of suggesting this, so I'm glad you've been a big part of doing this. And Dylan's give us fantastic show notes. So now we just go to reading the stuff here and we can sign off. No, we're actually going to talk about it. But I was just sharing with Dylan and Chris off podcast. One of the things that I like about doing the podcast is I like to think of myself as a good historical generalist. But then occasionally when we get down to a specific topic, it's like, I know generally where this is and what's going on, but then I have to do some research. And so getting ready for this one, I learned something today. So hopefully our audience will get a chance to do that if they don't know it as well. So Dylan, I'll let you sort of set us up. We're going to the 3rd century AD during the period of what is commonly referred to as the 3rd century crisis inside of the Roman Empire. So you want to sort of let our listeners know where we're going and sort of where we are in space and time before we go and, do what we do, shuffle that and change it up.
Yeah, so basically, to give a quick background on where Rome is at this point in time, we've gone through all of or most of the famous emperors. Your Augustuses, your Vespasians. We've killed off the Severan dynasty, which is sort of the last pre-Constantine major Roman dynasty, and we have gone on to the sort of Rolodex of pick your Roman general of the day for who's going to be emperor. This is a period where your reign gets measured in months, not years. And this essentially has devolved into this repeated succession crisis that's lasting for about 50 to 60 years. And it's really the closest point that Rome, before it did fall, ever came to completely collapsing into just instability and internecine fighting. In the year 260, an emperor was assassinated. The crisis was begun by an assassination, but in the year 260, an emperor is defeated in battle. The Emperor Valerian picked a fight with Sassanid Persia, got captured and killed, leaving his son Gallienus as ruler. At that point, you then have the Roman Empire split into three sort of unofficial empires, but essentially different governments. You have Rome in the center. You have Palmyra, which is the eastern sort of Anatolian, Egyptian, and Syrian kind of, your sort of traditional Alexandrian successor state area. And on the west side, you have what becomes the Imperium Galliarum, or the Gallic Roman Empire, consisting of France, Britain, or Roman Britain, modern day England, and Spain, founded by a guy named Posthumous. This is sort of a fascinating kind of creature of just weird bits of history you never really knew about, where you have an entire Roman successor state that happens in what we now consider Western Europe. In reality, it was very short-lived. It only lasted about 15 years. The founder, Posthumous, ended up getting killed, and nobody could really pick up the pieces, and everything sort of went back to Rome when a later emperor reunited it. But today, we're going to try and unposthumous Posthumous, if you will, and keep him alive. Basically, what happens is Posthumous ends up fighting a rebellion and sieging down a town where modern-day Cologne is, and then fighting off a rebellion, and he denies his troops the chance to siege and pillage the city after they've taken it. And because of his generosity, this is a classic Game of Thrones moment where the nicer you are, the worse you end up. Because his soldiers couldn't go sack the city, they decide to sack him, and they cut off his head. And that essentially spells the doom of this Gallic Empire. But today we're going to explore what happened if Posthumous had decided to let his troops have a wild weekend in Cabo, as we say, and let them go wild and not vent their frustrations out on him. We're going to see where history takes us.
I think you set that up brilliantly, Dylan. And again, I mentioned one of the things that I had heard the term Gallic Empire before, so I wasn't unfamiliar with the term when you suggested it, but then I had to go and look it up. You mentioned, of course, in the middle of the 3rd century crisis, which is this period in the 200s, hence the 3rd century, leading up to, it sort of comes to an end with Constantine reasserting the empire as we think of it again. Again, that's in 312 and 12ish, and in that area there is when that's happening there. But this is well before that. And I think what really struck me, Dylan, you talked about, I like the way you described it, that Rolodex, you could get a full top set of emperor trading cards. You'd have like 400 or 500 if you actually put them together. I mean, it wouldn't just be a small thing here. And but what really struck me in looking at him is, first of all, how fragmented the history is. It's a lot of, we think we know, we sort of know this. It's not one of the more well-recorded or documented periods of history in terms of what survived that is for sure. You sort of get the feeling, I get the feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, historians are sort of piecing this together from various things in terms of really understanding even some of the details. But also what struck me there was, this seems like a pretty competent guy at the end of the day. I mean, yes, as you said, it's short-lived. It's basically about a decade. But during that decade, the reason he thrives for more than a couple of months, which had been sort of the flavor of the month emperor approach in all parts of the empire, is he actually can handle himself on a field of battle, and apparently knows how to handle himself somewhat politically and in creating stability inside of the reign. And the other thing that really struck me is, apparently has an incredible amount of loyalty from the folks that are living in this part of the empire, because they've been sort of left to fend for themselves for a really long time. And so somebody who doesn't immediately, take care of them and then turn their eyes towards Rome as soon as they've got enough troops to go and do it was a rarity.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about it is, the Gallic regions and Britain too, and to a lesser extent Spain, they've been the wild frontier of Rome. The eastern portion is the sexy, rich part. It's got all the fun history. That's where Alexander is. That's where everybody wants to go hang out. That's where all the money is. What we consider, ironically, today is sort of the quote unquote Western Europe being sort of the cultured, regions of the world or of Europe. This is sort of like the wild woods in the back of your house where things go bump in the night. These people have been constantly under threat from Germanic invasions. And so Posthumous represented, one kind of a local boy. He's from Batavia, which is not necessarily in the heartlands of the Gallic sort of regions, but it's kind of in the neighborhood. And he literally could present himself as, hey, I'm this defender of the Gallic provinces. I'm this protector of the Gauls and, of Romans. Well, all the people down in Italy and further east, they're just fighting over who gets to sit in the chair. I'm the one that's out here actually fighting and protecting everyone. And he really bases that as sort of his position of power, so to speak. And, it's on all his coins. This is one of those periods in history. For anyone listening, if you're curious about what kind of stuff you can brag about, if you take up numismatism as a hobby, most of the historical stuff that we know about this period is basically all from coins. So shout out to any of the coin nerds. Just know you're appreciated for things like this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Chris, did you have any thoughts on what we've thrown out there just as a starting point?
Yeah, first, I would say on the numismaticist appreciation, I think the reason we don't have history from this time period is that emperors aren't around long enough for somebody to get done writing their history. If you think about Suetonius, who wrote the 12 Caesars, like he was coming a little bit before now when there was an established, we could all agree on what the truth is or what truth we're going to present about them. And during this period, yeah, there may have been 400 emperors. Very few of them probably ever made it to Rome. You would have an emperor along the Rhine. You would have an emperor in Britain. Very few of them actually conquered anywhere near what we would consider a modern nation-state size territory. The other thing that comes to mind is these are this is a real cultural division between these three areas that Gallic is a really good name for it because these areas were Gauls. The people here were Gauls. They were conquered by Caesar. Spain wasn't. I might have been an episode recently about the conquest of Britain. But these were just, they didn't think of themselves as having a history unified within an empire. Rome, the central portion, Italy did, and the East almost never reconciled itself to conquest by Rome. It always looked at itself as a Greek area. So culturally, I think these three areas, even if the fighting may have moved some of these borders around the border regions, these three areas are distinctly different, and it's really interesting to think about them somehow as part of one political entity, as opposed to just almost looking at this and assuming naturally that it's going to balkanize.
Yeah. And what strikes me about that too, Chris, as you were describing that, and I think that's a good background, is thinking about their culture, but at the same time, the structure of what Posthumous puts into place is very Roman. He copies basically the entire set of Roman institutions, a separate Senate, this idea of consuls, the things that are there. I mean, it was so, to me, one of the things that strikes me about him being again, just coming across as a very competent guy. That's what he reads from history in so many ways. Again, lasting more than a couple of years meant you had some level of competence, right? At least in terms of military or otherwise. But it's this idea that he recognizes, as sort of Dylan pointed out, his Gaulish roots or Gallic roots, and takes advantage of that as a way to consolidate and hold authority and power and exercise that. But at the same time, he's also very Roman because the structure that he imposes is copied on what had been Rome. So it is Rome and it's not Rome at the same time, I guess, is what I'm trying to say by going the long way around the block to do it.
And I think that's a really smart thing for him to have done, because if you think about this kind of historically, Rome borrows Rome claims to borrow a lot of Greek ideas, both Spartan and Athenian and other Greek ideas, but adapt them to local conditions and develop the political institutions like the Senate, as opposed to kind of an Athenian style direct democracy, that can support a polity, a political entity that can control the entire Italian peninsula and frankly the entire Mediterranean. While if you're building on traditionally Gallic political institutions, you're controlling a band or a city-state. So adopting these Roman institutions allows him to administer a polity the size of what he's got.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Dylan, any thoughts on any of that before we go off in a different direction?
Yeah, I just think it's kind of, it's one of the things about this podcast that's always so fascinating is exploring the parallels and sort of the echoes of what really happens. Because this is essentially, what this kind of conjures up is essentially just Charlemagne 700 years early, 600 years early. You have a Roman, educated, influenced, charismatic military leader who essentially unites, a huge swath of territory, under himself, essentially under a Roman model. But it's completely different from what we know, sort of post-Roman Empire. This is the Roman Empire 2.0 fighting against the Roman Empire 1.0 at the same time. I think it's just really kind of one of those interesting things to think about. Like this is a world where we're not going to have, Charles Martel and Charlemagne, but we're going to have Posthumous and whatever, his sort of dynasty ends up concocting instead.
Yeah, I think that was also what fascinated me as I was reading through your notes and thinking about this, is that idea of, and you hit upon it well, the nature of what this podcast has taught me is how history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. You've heard that statement before, because it does in slightly different ways, but boy, those echoes sure do look like the original so often. That's the nature of what's there. And part of where, talk about now the fork. So again, what we decided to do as the fork point is that he allows his troops to go, and the thing that causes him to die is he tells his troops, we're going to restrain ourselves here and you're not get to go sack the city, which by the way was an expected thing. If you were a soldier and you had laid siege to a town, one thing you expected to do was, what do you call it, the weekend in Cabo, Dylan? You expected to be able to go in and do what you were going to do, because that's what, to the victors go the spoils, and to the victors go the sacking, right?
How far is Amsterdam from Batavia? This is the thing going through my mind right now. But
I'll get back to you. I'll do some research and we'll get back to you. We'll do an update.
Yeah. So there's that part to it, but again, this goes back to what I've said before. That's a symbol of his competence, his thinking through things more in just the moment kind of, scenario. The fact that, one of the best ways to make sure that you can make this city now loyal to you so that it stands for you against someone else who wants to lay siege to it is what you do to it when you have the chance to sack it. And it seems to, as Dylan pointed out, it seems to, nice guys end up, hoisting themselves by their own petard kind of thing here. But that's what really strikes me as being interesting about this particular fork, is what causes his death is a lack of recklessness. And so we're saying that in order to survive, non-reckless guy, you got to let your folks do something that's reckless, right? Chris, were you going to say something?
I'm imagining kind of a mad bomber theory here, almost, in that to allow rationalism, sometimes they need to think, sometimes you'll be irrational.
Right. Makes perfect sense.
And the other thing is, just to kind of put this in perspective, this city was not a town. It was a pretty major imperial crossing. It was a rich city. It was where a lot of trade crossed into what is today Germany from what was the empire. So it's a very rich place to pillage. There's a lot of stuff there that would, let's say, entice Roman soldiers, but it's also a real prize if he keeps it intact.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I think, one of the interesting things about this whole area, we've tossed around, the differences between Gallic and kind of Roman culture, and you know, Rome, at least in the Republican age, still at this point somewhat in the imperial age. We haven't gotten to a sort of formal, really established sort of Byzantine, sort of born in the purple dynastic succession, truly established. You still have these sort of, emperors are still, at least in some sense, trying to pretend that they're not really imperial, or that they don't have all of the trappings of a monarchic, system. The Gauls don't necessarily have that. Like Chris mentioned, these are people that are used to operating in bands a lot closer, necessarily familially, in connection, than sort of some of the senatorial, families who were used to lording it over this mass of unwashed plebs. At this point, Rome's got over 1 million people in it. None of those people know their second cousins. It's not that kind of place. But to misquote Vin Diesel from The Fast and the Furious, Gaul is all about family. So, you could end up seeing this being sort of the progenitor of the modern kind of understanding of dynastic succession, that it takes Romans another few decades to find somebody who's successful enough and kind of indomitable enough to be able to really institute on an empire-wide scale.
The one thing I would say is, I feel like to accomplish that, what he would need is, since we're all over the ancient world today, almost a Sparta-like structure where he has his clan as overlords of this area, as a class, as a caste, just because he, to run an area this size at this point takes a lot. It takes a lot of people. And I'm not sure if the closeness that you're describing can expand out over this wider geographic area, unless what you might see is a series of clan alliances that would allow the extension of power.
And back to Dylan's point, and the point you just made there, Chris, is, one of the questions that always fascinates me is, how long does it take for something that changes culturally or politically to gain enough foothold that it becomes the new norm versus being the new thing? And, generally, I think that's more than a generation, right? In the classic sense, it has to be multi-generational for it to feel like it's lasted for more than a generation. That seems like an obvious thing to say, but to Dylan's point, when there's the year of 5 emperors, which sort of kicks this whole thing off, is sort of famously dubbed that. That's turning over at a pretty good clip. And then, as you pointed out, Dylan, it's however long you can hold it together, or however long the money lasts, in terms of how long you might be in that position. And then here comes somebody else. 10 years doesn't seem like a lot, but 10 years is a lot. How long would Posthumus's successors, again, this idea of either, through it a clan, through it relationships, whatever they're, what Christus, how long does it have to last before it has lasting power? Again, that also seems ironic to describe it that way, but I think you know what I mean.
I think ever since we left the Republican era, it's not, I don't want to think about this in terms of years. I want to think about this in terms of transitions. How many times has the person in charge changed? And we've danced around talking about picking a person by, this is the best general, or this is my son, in a dynastic format, or picking them, maybe even a senatorial selection of somebody to balance the power of these clans. But I think once you have 2 or 3 handovers of power, regardless of how frequently they are, and I mean more than a month apart, but once you have those transitions of power, and there are norms established about how the next person is selected, I think you really start seeing things start solidifying once it's not, like we were talking about, a free-for-all. As you know, people trying to move towards Rome. As soon as the emperor gets sick, every general tries to move there, because it's just going to be the strongest, or whoever has the most soldiers is going to win. Once you can establish some norms as to how that power transitions, and it's tested a couple of times, I think that's when you start seeing real establishment of a new structure.
So it's the it's the ordered transition of power that everybody assents to and agrees to, like we're still struggling with even down to this day, apparently. But anyway,
Right.
we will leave that where it's at. But I think that's a good point. So Dylan, let's say that Posthumous is able to live another 20 years. Let's just throw a number out there. I know Chris said it's not about numbers, but he lives long enough that this is not a 10-year thing, but a 30-year thing, old enough to have an adult child that in theory could be the not just the presumed heir, but a groomed heir that's ready to take over things. And so we've established this Gallic Roman third. That's firmly that it's going to transition smoothly. It's not going to get caught up in the rest of what's happening with the rest of the other 2/3 of the Roman Empire that are, again, going through Emperor of the Month Club. And so what does a stable Gallic Empire change? That's the whole point here with the fork. What's different?
So I think, so we've kind of touched on a couple of different possible things that change in a sort of structural, fundamental level, at least for Western Europe. I think one of the things, if you have an extended, more stable and more centralized Gallic sort of Roman institution, because I mean, say what you will about the inability to keep an emperor on the throne for literally 70 years at a time. The Roman, at least bureaucratic apparatus, was remarkably stable once it was in place. I mean, it's like Roman cement. It just does not leave. So if you have, something centered in, Cologne, or in one of these other towns in modern France that's a Roman outpost, if Posthumous has this essentially Roman copycat system, it becomes much easier to administer from a centrally, located position for all of these territories. And it becomes much easier to do what the Romans ended up in the real timeline did, in terms of just manning the Rhine, not going past it. Posthumous, is a lot closer to be able to react to German threats. He's got the, I'm forgetting, the Apennines, I think, is the Alps. He's got the Alps helping border him with Rome. So he essentially just has to, as long as he can get stable, he's pretty much fine from external non-Roman threats. And at this point, you have the Gallic Empire in the west, and you have the Palmyran Empire in the east, and essentially for this period of 15 years has neutered Rome. So if he makes it through this 15, 20 years, he's probably golden, at least in terms of the bureaucracy of setting up the state. I think having a son, Posthumous Jr., we'll call him, would be the natural successor. You can imagine that Posthumous would probably have groomed him to take over his command roles. He'd be familiar with the officers, but you wonder if, to Chris's point, he would also have, started marrying into or uniting the sort of entrenched tribal, alliances that were already there. You can imagine Posthumous trying to align his son to the chief of the Franks, or people who'd become the Franks, or some of the northern Spanish, the Basque, or the people who'd become the Catalan, and things like that. So I think you might actually have this cross between a sort of, Roman general as emperor state mixed with, the officer corps of his army, mixing with sort of the entrenched tribal local government to make this sort of hybrid, sort of clan officer kind of, military and sort of government structure that could potentially last for a long, long time, longer than even some of the Frankish post-Roman governments ended up lasting.
Almost Hellenistic.
Yeah, but with without any weird comic book based movies to cement their fame.
Okay, that was a Thor softball at you. You had to crush that.
Well, you got to remember the Vikings haven't come around yet.
Okay.
I've got my Viking jokes coming, but they're this is still several hundred years before Ragnar Lothbrok gets kicked into a snake pit.
I will say this, and I do think this is important, is how much this Gallic Empire recognizes itself as Gallic in this way. And when you were talking about where is its center of power, the first thing went through my mind is it is suicidal to put it on the Rhine, because that's asking to get sacked. I thought about Alesia in central France as just a natural, historically the importance of that area to a Gallic identity. The reason I'm talking about this is this. In all of these successor Roman empires, in all of the split-offs, every single one of them had pretensions to the Roman throne. Is this polity Gallic in nature, and is it happy being that? Or is it trying to take over northern Italy? Is it trying to attack, is it trying to rebuild Rome? Because that is a major source of conflict all the way down into into Charlemagne's reign and its relationship with the Byzantines. All of these polities are constantly identifying as Roman and have pretensions to take over everything that was Roman at one point.
Go ahead, Dylan.
Well, I was just going to say, I think, so that's one of the interesting things about Posthumous as a person, right, is once he founds this empire, he really doesn't go for the jugular like you think he would. He's content to just kind of sit, keep his territory. He's going to let, everybody else fight over the nominal, important part. He recognized that, at least for the way that he was maintaining power, his substance was better suited to just maintain what he had. And I think, to kind of analogize him to like a George Washington kind of figure, depending on what example he sets for a continued empire, assuming he behaves like he does in real history, where he just kind of sits and maintains the borders as they are, you may have the sort of Gallic sort of localization become much more entrenched. If he basically washes his hands of Rome, worst case, you may see some border skirmishes over, specific areas of the Alps, but you may see essentially a complete break between the sort of reclamation of Rome idea.
Yeah, I think that to me, that is what fascinated me, again, as I've said now multiple times, I'll try not to repeat myself. What fascinated me was I didn't want to learn more about the Gallic Empire as much as I wanted to learn more about Posthumous, because I think he's the unique secret sauce into what did work for a decade and what could have worked that we've talked about here for longer on. The other thing, Dylan, the idea you were just talking about there of taking the battle to Rome. Rome kept coming to him, so he didn't have to do that in many ways. So it was that value of understanding, a strategically defensive war, occasionally have to be tactically offensive, obviously, because that's the nature of what it was. But he successfully fended off multiple invasions from Rome proper, trying to bring them back into the fold. And I think that also was starting to also forge part of that identity. Part of, I think, the initial identity for these for those that have been, the Gauls that were in his care, was this idea of, protecting us from the Frank, from the threats that were further north and were further east in Europe. But then also he was protecting them, from the threat that was Rome. And so this what gets forged as a result of that is that's the fire that helps forge that combined identity that was already destined to maybe go down that path. And his identity inside of that helps put the stamp on that. And again, how he grooms Posthumous Jr., probably becomes the key to whether, if that first, what Chris was talking about, those successful, peaceful transitions of power, if that first one can do so, and you have, you don't have a screw up for a kid who gets it and who actually does what needs to be done there, I think then there's the real chance for the staying power that lasts for a couple of generations, which then become decades, which then become, centuries. And the next thing you know, you've changed the face of Western Europe. One of the interesting things that got mentioned off podcast when we were prepping is we're about 50 years shy of, the reunification essentially of the empire under Constantine. And the event that comes with that is the Roman Empire becoming Christian. So much so that eventually we have not just a Roman emperor, but we're going to throw a title in front of that Roman emperor in the future. He's going to be the Holy Roman Emperor.
And the importance of the relationship between Charlemagne and the church is a huge difference, is a huge delta between what we're talking about here and what does happen with a Charlemagne, because that's a very different relationship.
And now putting on my Christian history hat here, which I have one, I just have to stop and think about what it is. It's not that Christianity did not have inroads into what we think of as being Western Europe before Constantine, but it's a very different flavor of Christianity that has taken root there than you see further, east in terms of the Antioch and Alexandrian centers of Christianity that exist in the early part of the Roman Empire, but also existed before. And so I'm not saying that Western Europe doesn't become Christian necessarily, but I think it's very different than the Romanized version of Christianity, which is what we come to know so well as we move through history. I think it's if it is Christian, you could argue that it might not become as Christian as it did, but even if it does, I think it's even a different flavor of what's there.
I mean, even in our timeline, you did have a split between what are today Catholics, who are Roman Catholics, the church following Rome, and Eastern Orthodox, who took a lot of that Greek tradition with them. So you're still seeing the divide between those two things. I think you see a third. If Christianity does become the religion of the Gallic Empire, you have a third ecclesiastical tradition established in this polity.
Well, and let's not forget, shortly after, just a couple hundred years after, when in our timeline, Christianity was sort of entrenched and ensconced as the official religion, you have yet another major religion pop up in our sort of little mad world we're creating here is in the other third, the eastern third of our sort of broken up Roman Empire. You could maybe have sort of, kind of a more quote unquote Roman Catholic, Christianity sort of in the center, have a more sort of a weird cross between a sort of Hellenistic, but also, Islamic influenced sort of weird mishmash of, all those different religions, because in the East, you've got Zoroastrianism coming in, you've got some of these other, cults of Mithras and some other things like that. And in the West, I want to say, because so many of the Gauls were, the Romans describe basically everybody who was north of the Alps as Celts, at a certain point. They were all Celtic, even though some of them were Gauls, some of them were Belgian, some blah, blah, blah. So you might almost see, I can very much see, if you have a sort of entrenched Christianity, it becoming, a Jesus's druid kind of image. It's less of an entrenched Orthodox, canon that's built up of official rites. It's more of a kind of naturalistic, it's almost like a transcendental Christianity is kind of what I'm envisioning, maybe.
And the other thing I'm thinking about now is the power centers and how the power structures influence the structure of these churches. If you look at the Eastern Orthodox, while they're setting up this form of Christianity, it's collegial, it's Antioch, it's all of these different patriarchs getting together and establishing what it means to follow our religion. And in that, I see almost a Greek city-state structure. If you move it over to the Roman Catholic structure, there's one person. It is a top-down decision-making organization. That is more of the Roman centralization. So I think there's an argument to be made for an interesting, cloudy, amorphous, we're all going to kind of come together and agree upon or something like that, but a different structure for a Gallic Christian church.
I agree. And, I think this is a whole interesting thread to chase for me, particularly because of where my interests lie. But, Dylan, as you were saying that, I could easily imagine what you're talking about, that sort of Druidic influenced Christianity, or, even, Christianity dealt with the Greek concept of deity in one way in the East. Now you deal with the Norse Germanic concept of deity on the other side, which is similar but different, obviously. And I can't help but think, very much when I think about the real timeline, you tend to think of the Eastern Orthodox Church as being a little bit more tied into mysticism than the Roman Catholic Church ever was. So it's ironic to me when you're describing that, which I think is spot on accurate, this idea of, in my head, I'm almost transposing some of the things I know about the real timeline Eastern Orthodox churches over to being a little bit of this Gallic thing that you're talking about, but I know it would also be different at the same time. And then you suddenly bring in the influence of Islam potentially into what was going on in what we think of as this Eastern third of the Roman Empire. And you get a very different thing going on there. So I really start thinking way down the road here, because one of the things that struck me as being interesting about what composed, we've talked a lot about the mainland continent in this Gallic thing, but it also encompassed the British Isle. And so, there's this idea down the road, if there's more of a homogeneity between what we think of as being modern day Spain, France, and England, which is an interesting thing to even think about, that those are sort of a more common thing that survives through history in a different way, linguistically and culturally. Then the other thing that really strikes me there is, what if there's no Moorish Spain? The types of things that even, where Islam comes on to Western Europe proper and makes inroads into France before they're turned around, that type of thing. Now, I know I'm 1,000 years down the road from these events here, but that's a very different way that things flow through. And then the other thing that immediately jumps to mind is, I hear so often about, when does feudalism begin? When is proto-feudalism coming into play? It's not quite there yet, but it is starting to be there in this period of time that we're talking about now. So as the economic systems change as a result of the political system being somehow different. Oh, and yeah, throw the church in too, which we've already done here for the last 5 minutes.
So two things. First, I think feudalism does exist. If we get to that clan, there's a very clear line in my mind between a clan-based structure and a feudal structure, where the polity is organized along the lines of personal relationships and fealty between Posthumous' son and the princess of the Franks, and so on and so forth. The other thing I'm thinking about is this. I'm not convinced that you don't have something similar to Moorish Spain in this way. We've discussed this empire being very comfortable along the Rhine and along the Alps. That is not where Moorish Spain happened. And I could see them sneaking in the back door across the Straits of Gibraltar. If whatever does happen in the Palmyran, in the Eastern, whether maybe Islam is considered a reform movement within Eastern Orthodox Christianity or whatever originates there. I could still see it sweeping across North Africa the way it did and sneaking up on a Gallic Empire that has never really considered Spain as a border region.
Well, what I'm curious about is, I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting idea, but you do have to remember, there is at least a Roman psychology that Spain, is to be watched, from the Carthaginian days and some of the earliest real Roman sources of wealth before they took Egypt formally into the empire was, the Spanish silver mines were, not to mix a metaphor, but they were a gold mine for Rome. So, I don't know that it would be completely undefended, but I think you would at least see some kind of inroads, maybe not as far or as complete in Spain, but at least maybe part of it. I do. The idea of a Charles Martel, stopping, kind of a climactic last stand is just too good not to keep imagining. But
by the way,
I'm
maybe this happens in Algeria.
Yeah. It could be North Africa instead of Spain,
Right.
but somewhere in that neighborhood. The other thing that I'm interested in, and this is from, the standpoint of, us being an English language podcast, us, essentially our entire modern understanding of sort of Anglophile history, depends on a couple of very important things happening. If you have this sort of Gallic Roman Empire, you don't have, you may have a more centralized sort of Gallic state, but you also don't have a French king who can sell land to invading Vikings to sort of appease them and stop them from raiding into the empire. The Roman sort of, and Gallic Roman, I guess we'll continue to call it, political system, whatever it ends up being, is probably going to be different enough that there's at least not as much centralization because you don't have this Charlemagne figure. So, if there's no settlement of Vikings on the coast of Normandy, you don't have a couple hundred years later a certain guy crossing the pond or crossing the channel to go press his claim on the throne of England, and essentially creating the modern English history as we know it in this time.
Well, and then the other thing that I always get fascinated by when I think this through, it goes back to actually an episode that I did. I may reissue that because it sort of fits in with our arc now. One that I did a solo episode way back in the early days of the podcast, which is talking about Carthage, being successful in the Punic Wars. And, so Carthage comes out on top versus Roman. How would that be different? One of the things that would be different there is the Carthaginians were Phoenicians. They were a maritime people positioned in such a way that if they have a period of peace and prosperity where they're not having to deal with Rome as an aggressor, does a Carthaginian find their way across the Atlantic, a millennium earlier than, Vikings found their way across the North Atlantic, or Columbus, or whoever else you want to believe, finds their way across the Middle Atlantic or South Atlantic? And you just change this entire dynamic of how exploration may work. You mentioned there the idea, Chris, of, maybe the stand against the surges that are coming from the caliphates is, it's not taking the stand and ultimately, the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula. Maybe this happens actually in Africa, or maybe this Gallic Empire starts to stretch its legs not further east, because it's going to have issues if it wants to go further east into Central and Eastern Europe. So it takes the road less traveled, which is a little bit south, and maybe finds its way into Egypt through the back door kind of thing. There's lots of ways that this may play itself out that would redraw, to your point, Dylan, the map in such a way that it changes the way cultures interact, and then changes what we consider to be the West, the tradition that we've inherited here in the United States. And the fact that we all speak English, speaks to this, is that we've inherited this Western European Anglo-Saxon sort of, understanding of history. We're enough students of it that we look at other things, but maybe that doesn't exist as we know it.
So I'm thinking about a couple of things. First, we haven't really talked much about how does this Gallic Empire relate to some of the Germanic immigration that they're going to see. And the thing going through my mind when Dylan is talking about the Vikings coming in is maybe this is actually the kind of structure, the kind of polity that can accommodate them easier than somebody who's got immune Roman prejudices against these foreigners, in that these are Gauls. They already have a line, their structure is set up that will welcome you in, will marry with you, will allow you, will merge with you. So they can incorporate them in a different way than the French king selling land to the Vikings in a conflict-based relationship. The other thing that I'm thinking about is one of the groups you hear about, and Dylan kind of touched on them as a possible, early discoverer of the Americas, are the Basque, who are a very important seafaring people who would be at the very heart of this Gallic Empire. I just saw Dylan's eyes, his eyebrows go up. So I'm going to stop because I've got one more thing that crossed my mind, but I want to let him go where he's going with this.
Well, I think that's an interesting point because one of the things that made England and especially North France attractive for, because when I was in college, I became a bit of a Viking fanboy. So I've got a few Viking books on my shelf. One of the things that made Vikings want to go to England and to Northern France was this proliferation of Roman Catholic monasteries that were the primary source of easy to grab wealth that they could take back. If that is no longer on the table in the same way, the Vikings may still want to come over, but more in a sort of a search for arable settlement land than sort of a conflict, violence, raiding per se.
Frankly, maybe we view them more like the Russians view them than the Normans view them. They were a very important economic and trading people in Eastern Europe. Russia is named after them. So the relationship could be very different if you don't have a centralized church pulling all of the money together in these nice big banks waiting to be knocked over, which are what monasteries are.
Well, that and the Romans, especially in naval technology, they were not necessarily the greatest people on their own, but they were excellent people. They were the top of the class because they were very good at cheating. They could copy anybody's homework. I mean, the classic Roman trireme was just a Greek ship that they took.
I'm trying to figure out what the word in Latin for Kobayashi Maru is, and I'm just all over the place.
I don't think there's a Latin equivalence to a Japanese phrase. I hate to say it, but it's a good idea. But I wonder if you have a sort of more peaceable, gradual influence of the Vikings, do the Romans take this sort of iconic Viking ship design that ends up being what really starts the ability of long range oceanic travel? Do they take it for themselves? Do the Vikings in particular, start mingling with the Basque? Do you have a sort of random, instead of Vinland and Leif Erikson discovering Greenland and Nova Scotia, do you have a Gallic Roman explorer who ends up discovering some part of the New World? It's probably not, the technology is probably not there to do a significant colony, but is there some trading that goes on? Do you have the beginnings of some cultural interaction? I think it's kind of a fascinating thing.
So let me throw this out there. I think one of the really important factors in the way European expansion happened the way it did are two things happening very close to each other. The East being cut off with the fall of Constantinople, and all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of unemployed soldiers in Spain. When you marry those two things, look at the importance of those Spanish conquistadors in knocking over 2-3 continents at once. Well, now you're talking about a Gallic Empire that already has these structures set up to accommodate and ally and assimilate cultures, so that if this grouping makes its way to North America, you don't need to import that many people, because your mindset is not, we're going to come over here and displace you. Your mindset is, we're going to come over here and incorporate you. So maybe you have Iroquois representation in this Senate, or something like that.
I always love to make the jump. I've done it often on episodes in the past. Make the jump to the interaction between Europe, the old world, and the new world happen in different time frames and different parameters, because we know the story as it went down so well. And the other thing you mentioned, Chris, that there's a third thing that really influenced the Western Europe that comes to be the influencing factor for so much, and that's the plague. And you know, that's what ended feudalism in the classic sense, just because everybody's dead, and now the value of labor just went way up. And then the backdrop of what was there with the church as an institution we've already talked about is that a different structure that exists here now. And so you change a lot of things there. You know, I can imagine this scenario. We've gone way afield from where we started, and he let the troops sack the city. But that's what I like here, is that at some point the Mongols are still going to come west, and do they suddenly find themselves encountering the eastern edge of this Gallic Empire that's expanded to where it is and that's diversified the way that it has. And to me, history is also interesting when viewed as a clash of cultures, be they slow clashes or be they instant clashes. And that class of cultures could be a very interesting thing to think about, after they've established themselves for some period of time. And again, it all goes back to this decision to sort of bring it all back home again, and bring it back to the shorter time scale than where we've gotten it here. Is this, it doesn't take but maybe 15 or 20 more years of stability from that one decision that ended up making the troops so they didn't turn on you and kill you, that can set this whole thing into motion. It's a small thing at first, but it becomes a much bigger thing later. So this is what I love about the butterfly effect of history, is because at some point what actually happened there was the troops had to have come to him. This is the scene that I've painted in my mind when Dylan was suggesting this fork, is the troops come to him basically saying, we've captured the city. And he says, here's my order. We're not going to sack the city. And there's some disaffected, probably middle tier military, person there that says, I don't like that decision. What are we going to do about that, boys? And that's when the decision happens. And again, they only need to look around a little bit, as Dylan was describing here. You look around and say, all you got to do to change things here is you kill the guy that's in charge. Somebody else is always willing to step up and be that. And so that one decision, becomes the trigger point moving forward. Did we miss anything big here, Dylan? We chased some woodland creatures way deep into the brush. Did we miss any deer that were sitting right there on the path?
No, I'm sure I can find some more weird tangents for us to go down, but at a certain point, I think people would be afraid to see the timestamp for how long the episode is, and they'd be afraid to listen. So yeah, I think we got all the majors covered.
Yeah. So again, to me, what's fascinating about this, I've said before, I don't want to repeat myself, but this is what's fascinating to me. It's easy to overlook the Gallic Empire and say, well, that was just part of that 3rd century crisis, and it was one of the things that rose for a period of time, just like other things rose for a period of time. But it rose for a little bit longer period of time and had the potential to be different than a lot of what was going on around it. I guess that's the point, is that we talk about viable forks often when we're talking about topics. Is this a viable fork? That's one of the things we look for. This is a viable fork. This could have been different, and the difference could have made a big difference. Any closing thoughts, Chris?
Not really. I do, I'll be honest. Thank you for not calling me out by name, because I feel like a lot of the times you've been doing a podcast episode where you had to do the research and not been 100% comfortable. I've been the one throwing you into that deep end.
Yeah, no problem at all. It's what I enjoy doing.
But
And yeah, to your point. Go ahead, Chris.
but I feel like I also kind of came to this as a little bit like what you were saying, not having been a Viking enthusiast at any point in my life. But the thing I found interesting about this episode is the ability to make the connections to other things. While we may not know much about here, we're talking about Hellenistic power structures. We're talking about the divide between the churches and how they decide to make their decisions. We're talking about, we literally redid colonization of the Americas. So it's really interesting to be able to take an area that we may not really feel comfortable working in, because I'm sorry, if I collect coins, they go in a bank. But to take an area we're not comfortable with and be able to draw those strings to things we do see and see the echoes in places we are familiar.
I think that's a good point, Chris. And it's again the thing that doing this podcast now for almost 200 episodes, we're coming up towards 200 episodes here pretty soon, even with our hiatus period, is it's seeing the echoes, it's seeing the similarities, but also recognizing even in the echoes what's different. If that seems contradictory, it is to a degree. It's that that's sort of like this, but here's why it's not, kind of thing. And recognizing the difference there is a big part of that. And again,
a lot like the church in Charlemagne, completely,
Yeah, they're similar. One of the things I thought about, this is an early Charlemagne, except it's not, because Charlemagne comes out of a particular situation that's already in place, where, again, as Dylan and Chris pointed out, both of you probably pointed out, this idea that he's able to take advantage of the relationship that already exists between political apparatus and the church that doesn't exist at this point, which makes it a big difference. Any closing thoughts, Dylan? Anything you want to throw out there?
No, I think we've just about covered it.
Okay. Well, he's only 5 days old as of the period of time of this recording, so it'd be a little early for the newest member of our team. But we've made the decision that he is part of the team, even though you won't hear his voice for a while. For those of you that have heard us talk about Alexis expecting, I'm happy to say that Connor has arrived, and that son and my daughter, Mom, are doing well as Dad there. So I just mentioned that to say to those of you that may be asking about that or wondering about that, because we've made indirect mention to it on the podcast, know that happy event has happened. And if you check out the website, at some point you'll probably see a picture of him there listed as a special member of the team, junior member of the team, whatever we're going to call him here. I don't know what that's going to be, but Connor has arrived and everything went well. So happy for Alexis and her husband Jake, and obviously happy for myself, because this puts me into grandfather territory, which I understand is so much fun that if I knew it was going to be the case, I would have had the grandkids first, from what I understand.
Well, I also do enjoy that we have now established a political succession for the podcast.
It's all about
established how the power, how the seat you started talking about can be passed down.
Yeah, it's not a throne made out of swords, to borrow the analogy that was made there earlier. And I don't know if I would want to be a Targaryen. Definitely not the case here. But yes, we have a multi-generational succession plan now in place for the podcast if we need that. And hopefully we might. The other thing I did want to mention is one of the things that popped into my head, because it's actually in our A Fork in Time Room Where It Happened store. We actually have merchandise. Just guys, people may not know this. I actually often wear actually what I wear often. You guys have seen it as a cap that has the logo on it. That is one of my favorite go-to caps. That actually is not in the store, but there is some cool looking stuff, mugs and jerseys and other stuff like that. I just mentioned that to say that one of the things we're doing here with the relaunch, if you haven't had a chance to visit the store, there's some cool stuff there. There's some of our Inspired By series that, Chris is one of the Inspired Bys there. Eric Rush was another one. The whole thing about Wyoming, if you listen to the live stream, you'll know what we're talking about there. There's a series of Inspired By shirts. If any of those things float your boat, one of the things that we're doing now in honor of the relaunch is there's a promotional code, relaunch 10. So if you go there and find something that you like, you can get 10% off by using Relaunch 10, and that'll be good through the end of the year. So if you haven't visited the store, you can find there's a link there'll be a link in the show notes. You can also find it at the website. But one of the things that is at the store that I have yet to buy that I have to buy is there's a onesie. There's a Fork in Time onesie that I need to buy for my grandson. So I'm a little remiss. Wanted to see what the actual size was going to be before I went and did that. But at some point, the picture that you may see of Connor on the website will be him sporting a Fork in Time merch, even as an infant. So we got that there if you're looking for it. And the other things you can do at the website, of course, to get our entire back catalog. We've kept and we'll keep the podcast forever free. That's one of the things we've committed to. There's a lot of monetization of podcasts going on these days. If you're not familiar with it, subscribing to that. We don't require that. Yeah, you can become a patron through our Patreon link, which is, giving a little money towards the podcast. And that's helpful because it helps defray the cost. They're not huge, but it's nice to defray them. I mentioned that to say that one of the things that we do, and we're in the better habit now of getting our episodes recorded ahead of time. So one of the things that our patrons get is an early look at an episode. And we'll be doing more and more of that, and the better that we get the catalog built. But one of the interesting things with the relaunch, I see statistics, guys, and it was one of the cool things to see. I saw the numbers obviously moving back up in the terms of number of listeners. And then I can tell when people have found the podcast because I suddenly see a lot of downloads from the back catalog. It's like all of a sudden there's one of every episode, for the first 180 that gets downloaded in one day. I'm like, okay, somebody has found us, and now they're in catch-up mode, and they'll catch up to real time here. So I think you'll see the evolution of the podcast well over time. And part of the evolution, I'll close with this, with the guys that I see on the screen here. I did not know a Chris Coppola. I did not know a Dylan Holzheimer when we started this thing. And as a result of doing this thing, I do, and I get to laugh with them and have fun with them. So guys, anything you want to say before I close this out here for good? All right. We're going to suggest to you, as we normally do, if you happen along a Fork in Time, our suggestion here from a Fork in Time is take it. Have a good one, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.